I have the pleasure of introducing the next keynote presentation by Dr. Brent Slife. Dr. Slife was, until his recent retirement, professor of psychology at Brigham Young University. While at BYU, he was honored with their highest faculty award, the Carl G. Mazur Distinguished Lecturer, as well as the APA Presidential Citation for his contributions to the field of psychology. He has also served as the president of the Society of Theoretical and Philosophical Psychology and is currently the editor-in-chief of the APA Journal of Theoretical and Philosophical Psychology, as well as the editor of a Routledge book series. Dr. Slife has authored or co-authored over 250 articles and 11 books and continues his psychotherapy practice of over 35 years where he specializes in marital and family therapies. Today, Dr. Slife poses the provocative question, have social scientists properly understood crisis-related human relationships? We'd love for you to join us after for a live question and answer session.
Hello. You can probably guess my answer to the title question. I wouldn't ask whether social scientists had properly understood crisis-related relationships if I thought they had. I'm especially concerned about the care given to crisis victims, both before and after crises. Too many caregivers seem to act on social science information in ways that misunderstand the vital import of human relationships in crisis. I think you're all aware of this import. Considerable research indicates that meaningful human relationships are involved in the problems that result from crisis and in our attempts to remediate these problems. Common maxim in my discipline, it's the relationship that heals. Human relationships appear to be a pivotal element of healing in crises, whether it's the relationship of the clients to the caregivers or the relationships of persons to their community. Consider this quote from a noted psychological researcher on healing, and I quote, "Relationship accounts for dramatically more of the variability in outcomes than does the totality of specific ingredients," unquote. And intriguingly, there's evidence that meaningful relationships are crucial not only across many different crises, different kinds of crises, but also across many different types of culture. What is the nature of this intriguing, perhaps even universal link between meaningful human relationships and crises? My purpose today is to describe a theoretical framework for starting a conversation that could begin to address such questions. I believe that even this crude starting point exposes some gaping holes in our understanding. I am most aware of those in my discipline of psychology, but I fear that social scientists more generally might be misunderstanding meaningful human relationships in ways that actually disallow their meaningfulness. As a result, I fear that many well-intentioned caregivers aren't nearly as helpful to crisis victims as they could be. These fears originate from two very different sources of my own experience, my clinical work and my philosophical understanding. Crisis giver and academic. Regarding the clinical, I've been a practicing clinical psychologist for 35 years, specializing in the crises of marriage. Here I've repeatedly seen my clients and my students routinely misunderstand what good relationships are and should be. Regarding the philosophical, I'm an academic who's currently the editor-in-chief of the APA Journal of Theoretical and Philosophical Psychology. That's a mouthful. I mention this editorial responsibility because I've learned through this role that there are at least two very different understandings of relationship, one stemming from individualism and the other stemming from what's sometimes known as relationality. Unfortunately, I believe that too many social scientists have embraced the more individualist view, despite what many would claim is a systems approach. To get a handle on these issues, I'd like to begin today to start with some elementary philosophy, which many of you may already know. Still, I think the need for it is important because I don't want to retread old, tired notions of collectivism that I think many of them have been largely discredited. This is part of the reason that I want to start with the philosophical. Some of the deeper issues have been lost in discussions of collectivism. So allow me to begin with the atomism-holism distinction in philosophy. And also I want to, please forgive me for the oversimplifications of my presentation. I can provide references for a deeper dive into the philosophical and the clinical. But my presentation today will necessarily be more thin than thick. My intention is to provide you a cursory overview to give you a sense of the conversation I believe we need to start having. Let's start with a few of the many differences between an atomistic and a holistic perspective of the world. Atomism here is the notion that the properties or qualities of things come directly from the things themselves, from what is contained within the boundaries of the object or person. To understand a hammer is to focus on the hammer, its shape or weight, with no need to reference relationships outside of the hammer. Likewise, Billy's intelligence comes directly from Billy, whether his body, mind, or some combination. And as one last example, the redness of my shirt today, at least I hope it's close to red, its color, perhaps its textural qualities, are considered part of the shirt, with again no reference needed to external relationships. The atomistic world is a world of self-contained objects, or atoms. Atoms in the metaphorical sense that interact by bumping into one another through causes and effects, stimuli and responses. On the other hand, the breed of holism I have in mind would argue against these atomistic assumptions. The qualities of things do not originate from the things themselves, but from their relationship to other factors, their environments, their cultures, and so on. And please don't presume that holism only applies to the social sciences. Nobel physicist David Bohm is famous for saying that physics can no longer tolerate an atomistic understanding of the world. Recent science demands, as he put it, and I quote, a new non-fragmentary worldview, unquote, where the world is a web of relationships like the text of a book. The words of that text do not need to bump into one another through cause and effect because they already embody interaction through relationship. Indeed, the words only have their identities or their meanings by virtue of their relation to other words. From this holist perspective, then, the identity or meaning of a hammer or a red shirt is only discernible in relation to context. The identity of the hammer is a nail pounder in one context and a weapon in another. The red shirt is only red by virtue of its light source. Under a blue light, for instance, the red shirt is black or gray. And similarly for Billy's intelligence in this holistic world, he may be intelligent in school, but he suffers greatly from street smarts. In these senses, contends the holist, people aren't objects with their own properties. They are a unique nexus of relationships. Now, I realize that we're only talking about differences between atomism and holism, but I want to keep their tension alive, at least for the time being, because it's mostly been lost, in my view, in Western culture. Indeed, many Western versions of individualism have served to institutionalize atomism. I specifically have in mind what's sometimes known as liberal individualism, where, as Robert Bellah once noted, there reigns an atomistic understanding of personhood. I use the term institutionalize because I don't want to discount the many contributions of liberal individualism to Western cultures. As I'll try to show, however, This institutionalization has hindered Western social sciences from understanding relationships, I believe, more deeply and more broadly. One approach to combating this institutionalization is to champion a wholly other type of personhood. Hence my support today for a more holistic type. Again, not referring to collectivism per se. I see too many social scientists blithely affirming individualism without full awareness that they are, or without full awareness of their relational implications. And this latent loyalty extends to many social scientists who believe they are affirming holism through systems theories. So I'll first discuss the implications of these philosophies for the person, taking into account the possibility of systems theories, and then I'll move to their practical implications for human relationships in crisis. Perhaps most importantly for the individualist, self-contained beings are the basic unit or end of social reality. In this sense, communities are viewed as aggregates of, and indeed serving individuals first and foremost. The purpose of community is to serve the satisfaction of the individuals within the community. The purpose of individuals, similarly, is to serve their own satisfaction. The individual's notion of satisfaction typically manifests itself in several ways, but perhaps most notably in the well-known goal of many in Western culture, to be happy, or alternatively to experience well-being, peace, or flourishing. Needless to say, anything and anyone who can contribute to or serve this individual happiness is highly prized. Taking its cue from holism, on the other hand, relationality has dramatically different implications for personhood. Analogous to words in a text, individuals derive their identities from their relationship to one another. I have a shared being with others. I'm not first an individual and then I form relationships. I'm a relationship all the way down. My identity, my meaning in the textual sense, stems ultimately from my interpersonal, physical, cultural, and temporal context. This relational perspective doesn't mean that I can't have an individuality of sorts. But my uniqueness does not stem solely from within the boundaries of my skin, but also from the unique nexus of the relationships of which I'm part. I'm a father, cousin, presenter, husband, and professional, all of which require relationships. As you can imagine, community looms large in this perspective. It isn't the means to individual ends as it is with individualism. If anything, the reverse is the case. Human relationships are more the end, with individuals as the means. Yet even this is oversimplified because individuals are already relationships. What then are the caregiver implications of these individualist and relational approaches to interpersonal connections? Because of the shortness of my time, I can't draw a full comparison here. Allow me instead to discuss a few items of difference that seem important to crises. They're not a how-to, I want to warn you, but they should contribute a rough theoretical framework. As I believe you'll soon see, relational approaches are different enough from individualist approaches to become an entirely new project for our disciplines, though we are not, of course, without some resources already. Allow me first to describe an important similarity, first, between the two approaches. Professionals from both typically embrace the crucial nature of relationships for humans generally, and crises specifically. In this sense, most professionals are relationists of sorts. The main difference then is between those who embrace these two the main difference between these two philosophies is the type of relationship considered most important, which leads in turn, I believe, to some pivotal practical differences in how social scientists should deal with crises. Given my limited time, I'll narrow my focus to just three basic questions in caring for crisis victims. Number one, what is the major goal of this caring? Number two, what are the coping skills needed for the losses that incur sometimes in crises? And three, how should victims deal with the suffering and despair that many crises bring? As a shorthand, I'll refer to a stereotypic individualist and stereotypic relationist as some pure form of each philosophy for simplicity's sake. However, I would never disallow the possible mixture of the two in practice. Consider the first question. What main goal would each approach want crisis victims to move toward? Here, individualists would clearly want to help victims approximate well-being, whether it's lifting their spirits, enhancing their self-images, or strengthening their egos. The greatest good from this perspective is a hopeful start to future flourishing and eventual happiness. Everything else serves this individual good, which means that relationship itself is a means or instrument of that good. What is sometimes known as instrumental relationships. Instrumentalism is the notion that only the real or important relationships are those that benefit the individual in some manner. Instrumental relationships also loom large because the moral traditions that might identify other relational goods are typically undermined in individualism. These other traditions, are typically too constraining for the autonomy of individualism. Who knows better, declares the individualist, what is better for the individual than the individual? Other traditions are generally too authoritarian to truly help individuals decide what's good for them. How widespread is this instrumentalism in social science? I think you might be surprised at its often taken for granted status. I'll just give some examples. My field of psychotherapy is fundamentally a mutual using or instrumentalizing of one another, with therapists getting the bucks and clients getting the benefits. There are exceptions, of course, but typically the relationships celebrated in therapy are the win-wins, reciprocal instrumental relationships. So-called systemic approaches to crises are often billed as non-individualist, but when family or community interventions are conceptualized and deployed, their benefits are almost always understood and measured as individual outcomes of satisfaction. Better quality relationships are rarely the goal, especially if they occur without individual satisfaction. Consider marriage as a simple form of human system in this regard. All formal measures of marriage involve individualist satisfaction. Is each spouse happy? In fact, many divorce researchers point to the perceived importance of emotional satisfaction as a pivotal factor in high divorce rates. Marriage is a means, right, to the happiness of each individual. Another indicator of our discipline's individualism is how difficult it is for many professionals to even imagine marital quality without individual satisfaction. Many have argued that marital quality is always accompanied by individual happiness of each partner. However, aren't there all kinds of examples that belie this argument? Consider, for instance, the marital partner who struggles to provide menial care to a dying spouse. Both could be unhappy, but relationship quality could be quite high. Or consider two addicts happily shooting up with little relational quality. My point is that relationship quality is not identical to individual well-being. Yet alternative ways of measuring relationship quality are rarely, if ever, discussed in the literature. Relationists, by contrast, champion non-instrumental relationships. Now, I hate the term non-instrumental here, but these relationships require a wholly different conceptualization. The term agape love might be a possibility. There are lots we could discuss. But agape love is often defined, even this term can mean the best for other individuals in the relationship, such as their self-contained happiness again. Let's use the term today, meaningful relationships. Perhaps the most provocative implication of a relational understanding of meaningful is that the importance of individual happiness and well-being fall away. A relationist contends that we should care about and attempt to strengthen interpersonal relationships even at our own expense, including the expense of our well-being. It is a moral good, in this sense, when a person chooses suffering or sadness for the sake of a relationship. This doesn't mean that happiness and well-being are unimportant. They just aren't the ultimate goals of good life. Good relationships can certainly lead to happiness, but as I've mentioned, other outcomes are possible. But what are good or meaningful relationships? Here I'd personally recommend the relational ethic of Alistair MacIntyre and Michael Sandel for evaluating good relationships. Indeed, I believe the ancient philosopher Aristotle described a similar virtue ethic that I think works quite well in this regard, which we could discuss. However, in considering such a discussion, I'm immediately aware of a question that often stymies such discussions. The question is, whose morality? Why virtue ethics over some other ethic? We often don't realize when raising this question that it stems from liberal individualism again. The individualist fears the authority of a moral tradition other than the personal autonomy, in fact, any moral tradition I'm aware of, other than the personal autonomy of the individualist tradition. Please know, however, that there are many resources for cutting through these fears. My most recent book with Stephen Yanchar, entitled Hermeneutic Moral Realism, attempts to show how morality can be both non-individualistic and contextually sensitive. As a testament to the practicality of this moral approach, I'd cite the virtue ethics of a therapeutic boarding school I helped to establish some 15 years ago, still going strong. And unlike individualism, all moral traditions are available for discussion. Did you catch the news when 4 nurses explained their decision to travel to New York City to save lives? Their reason? Well, it clearly wasn't their happiness because they left home and hearth as well as lost their jobs. They lost that all. It was, said one nurse on behalf of the others, quote, just the right thing to do, unquote. I'd bet that some moral tradition other than individualism led them to this decision. We'll return to these nurses later. Bottom line at this point is that the major goal of caretakers is the difference between facilitating individual happiness versus facilitating good relationships. What about the second question concerning loss, the loss in crises? If you're the individualist, how do you cope with the loss of well-being or happiness in crisis, including the resulting stress, anxiety, or depression? Coping strategies run a gamut, of course, but as I've mentioned, one of the most prominent in the social sciences is the development of human relationships, or what is universally labeled as social support. Is this individualist coping strategy instrumental? consider even the term social support. Is this individualist, doesn't this term imply that social is a means, a support for something else? What does the social support? Here, of course, the implicit, if not explicit, objective of social support in at least a lot of the literature is the benefit of the individual. I realize that this strategy doesn't have to result in instrumental relationships per se. Meaningful human relationships can, of course, be the unintended outcome. Still, if meaningful relationships are the intended outcome, shouldn't we reconceptualize social support, at least the term? And if instrumental relationships are the intended outcome, where our crisis victims are taught to use relationships to gain ego strength, for example, then how effective are these relationships in truly helping victims, particularly in the long run? This question can, and I think probably should, be framed as an empirical question, but it's very clear the relationists would bet against the deep and long-term effectiveness of teaching people to treat their relationships instrumentally. Many who are aware of the difference between instrumental and what we're calling here meaningful relationships would contend that the instrumental is a faux relationship, a cheapening of what human relationships should be when others are treated more as ends than as means. Business management texts are perhaps the prototype of what the teaching of instrumental relationships can become. My concern with crisis caregivers is they could practice a kind of an unconscious instrumentalism. They're either taught instrumentalism in their crisis training, or at least a lot of them could be, or they might have known little else in their personal lives. In either case, this teaching is then relayed to crisis victims for developing their own social structure. And instrumentalism becomes a way of being, the feeling we get when people look through us to engage others, or when we know we're being warmly greeted because the person wants something from us. In fact, I fear that instrumental relationships are most prevalent as almost automatic ways of relating. When I lecture on instrumentalism in one of my classes, for instance, I inevitably get a flock of students who apologize to me because they thought of me as an instrument of their own goals, their grades or future jobs. The relationist, by contrast, is less concerned about the loss of well-being and more concerned about the loss of meaningful relationships. If relationships really are the ends rather than means, then the termination of meaningful relationship is the greatest of all human fears. Even the existentialist fear of death is really a fear of relationship, or fear of the loss of relationship in death. The anxiety and depression that really matters in this sense is not the loss of individual ego or individual security. It's the loss of meaningful relationship. I can't tell you how often I've seen my own clients become so fearful of relationship termination that they become abjectly self-defeating, terminating their most cherished relationships before someone else could. Social science desperately, I believe, needs to understand this relational vulnerability. The nurses in my example talked about their sometimes intimate connection with their terminally ill patients. But they must have had skills in coping with the death of such relations. Otherwise, they'd have been devastated, as some suicidal nurses report. We need to understand and foster these coping skills in crisis victims. As a final related set of practical implications, let me now consider the question of how individualism and relationality differ in their understanding of the suffering that so many crises bring. As we've already noted, the individualists focus on emotional satisfaction, implies that suffering and despair should be avoided and if experienced, should be eliminated, if possible. Indeed, diagnosable variations of these, such as depression and anxiety, are often automatically considered problems. And we've already dealt with individualist strategies like the development of support groups that are deployed to reduce problems in the victims of crisis. Relationists can, of course, see the wisdom of some reduction in suffering. Intense suffering, after all, allows for little else. Even so, relationists would argue that the goal of automatic removal of suffering is misguided because it disallows an exploration of the suffering to understand it. There are, from their perspective, many lessons that should be learned. Some of the relational literature in this regard uses the metaphor of light and dark, where relationists believe that the focus of Western professional culture is too much on bringing light, such as increasing the light of knowledge. They see this light instrumentalized and linked to the individualist desire to better predict and control our lives. In this sense, individual security is enhanced and crises are considered less likely. Darkness is also vilified as uncertainty and crises identified as dark times. Considerable energy is also expended to keep away the darkness of suffering and sadness through some sort of manufactured light, either driving away literal darkness with electrical light or dispelling metaphorical darkness through the knowledge that alleviates suffering. This intention to keep the darkness at bay is wonderful in many senses, but the relationist reminds us that it leaves us often distinctly unprepared for the darkness of crisis. In other words, what happens when manufactured light, whether electrical or medical, is unavailable? What happens in a crisis where we lose control of our lives or are significantly less predictable? Relational thinkers such as Richard Rohr and Wendy Farley argue that social scientists need a greater understanding of darkness to prepare caregivers and victims for the inevitability of crisis. This kind of thinking is, in fact, forced on relationists, not only because of the inherent relationality between light and dark, but also because meaningful relationships inevitably involve suffering and despair. We are uniquely vulnerable when we truly care about others, and those relationships cannot always be predicted and controlled. As C.S. Lewis once put it, and I quote, "To love at all is to be vulnerable. Love anything, and your heart will certainly be wrung and possibly be broken," unquote. If we don't one day face the crisis of a pandemic, we'll one day face a personal darkness that no manufactured light will ever be able to overcome. Intriguingly, many of these relational thinkers attribute our Western focus on light to the legacy of the Enlightenment, which not coincidentally includes individualism itself. Rohr recommends instead that we also include some understanding of endarkenment in the caregiver's toolbox. He cites Jung as saying, and I quote, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious," unquote. Farley advocates something similar called tragic vision, with both thinkers arguing that the advantages of darkness have been overlooked in the Enlightenment. The dark can be seen as scary with uncertainty, but it can also be viewed as pregnant with possibility. More than a few people in our current darkness of crisis have rediscovered the joy of dinners together or deeper relationships with their families. Darkness can also reveal much about ourselves, our vulnerability and fragility, our lack of control and predictability, our dependence on technology, and the shadows of our own identities. Indeed, some of the most profound learning and growth occurs through facing the darkness of our lives. As Aeschylus, the father of tragedy, once wrote, and I quote, "He who learns must suffer," unquote. Allow me to conclude today by formalizing a few social science implications of this relational embrace of the connection between light and dark. First, it means reconsidering the Enlightenment legacy in our own disciplines. It isn't accidental, for instance, that two of the more significant goals of social science, at least as mentioned by method text, are prediction and control, the very things we were just talking about. Second, this embrace means studying something like endarkenment, where we don't consider pain, suffering, and our shadows as apart from, but rather a part of ourselves and our lives. Third, rather than automatically seeking to salve emotional pain, we first endeavor to understand and learn from it. Fourth, the lessons learned may help us with future prediction and control, but the relationist is also interested in finding meaning in those aspects of our lives that are fundamentally unpredictable and uncontrollable, such as meaningful human relationships. I'm confident that if we can craft a framework that doesn't automatically instrumentalize human relationships, we'll one day be able to help victims live into their meaningfulness. Thank you.